This reflection will be based on the last two sections of Chapter 2, pages 27 through 31, beginning with the section entitled, Two Types of Sorrow. You might have been struck by that expression we heard toward the end of the last reflection, the expression popular pity. And Monsignor borrowed that from Flannery O'Connor. She used it to describe what she calls the loss of vision from which we suffer these days, the loss of vision. Monsignor picks up with it again here on page 27. So what is this loss of vision? Now, it's not that we can't see suffering. We see the suffering of others. Everyone does. But popular pity is blind to the good that may come through suffering, to what may be being offered to us in the experience of suffering. Modern man is often blind to that. Another way to say this is that modern man doesn't so much look at things by the light of faith anymore. Faith looks into suffering, trusting that God is permitting it for some reason to find something that he might be trying to offer to us right there in the suffering. So we said this before, but faith is a way of seeing, a way of looking at things. I think that's really important to repeat, because if we stop thinking of faith as a way of seeing, then we tend to reduce it to one of three things, either sentimentality or tenderness or theory. And if faith is mere sentimentality or tenderness or theory, then suffering is reduced to a problem. Now it's just something in the way, a nuisance, instead of like a way that God can use to communicate something to us. That's why Monsignor dislikes this reduction of faith to sentimentality, because it leads to ending the life of the person who is suffering for the sake of ending the suffering. We should try to sympathize, in some sense, with those who think this way, because surely no one truly desires to end the life of another person. I think people who do always feel like there's no other choice or they have to. Even if they do so with malicious intent because of evil in their heart, it's still a sad thing. We can say that even those who say they feel no remorse about it, they don't really ever escape the torture of guilt that manifests itself in so many ways. So we're not without compassion for those who think that our only option is to eradicate suffering, but we should also be about the work of helping them to look with the eyes of faith at the reality of suffering. And to do that, of course, means introducing them to Christ. We just heard this past Sunday, St. Paul said, "We proclaim Christ crucified." We proclaim Christ crucified, a stumbling block to Jews and foolishness to Gentiles. But to those who are called, meaning those who look at life by the light of faith, Christ, the power of God and the wisdom of God. Yeah, so whether you're Jew or Gentile, the gift of faith can be given to you, and then you can see Christ crucified as the power of God in this broken world and the wisdom of God in this foolish world. You can see Christ laying his life down for us. He dies that we might live. And this is why Albacete says on pages 27 and 28 that if tenderness is uprooted from Christ, it becomes evil. Now, let's just stay with this for a moment. If tenderness is uprooted from Christ, it becomes evil. Here's an image to help you to understand what he means by this. Imagine your parents gift you a tree from a nursery. They deliver the tree to your front yard. Its roots are wrapped in burlap. "Thank you," you say to them. "How lovely. And look, its leaves are beginning to bloom. I love it. Thank you so much." Okay, now imagine that months and months go by. Your parents call and ask if the tree has begun to bear fruit. And you reply that it hasn't, but that you're looking forward to when it does. And then they ask you about where you planted it. And you reply, "Oh, we haven't planted it, actually. It's still sitting where you had it delivered, and its roots are still in burlap." Now, obviously, your parents are going to say, "You have to plant it in the soil. If you don't plant it in the soil from which it receives its life, it will die." You'll have two options. Enjoy it for the rest of its short life until it dies, or plant it that it might continue to live and to bear fruit. Now, it seems to me that Albacete is saying that tenderness uprooted from Christ, or popular pity, is really a virtue that is uprooted from the soil of Christ. And because it is uprooted from him, it dies and bears no fruit. So what begins with compassion ends in despair, and what begins with tenderness ends with the gas chamber. That's why the next section is entitled Tenderness, in quotes, Tenderness leads to the gas chamber. And Monsignor picks up with Walker Percy. We spoke of him briefly before. Monsignor loves him. Anyway, Percy, this American convert to Catholicism who lived and died in the American South, he wrote about faith, what he called the search, with such intensity because he believed it was this way of looking at reality that was so often cut out of the heart of men, or choked off, as it were, by the many ways that we distract ourselves from God in this culture of thorn bushes. But even before thorns can threaten a sapling, that tree must first be planted, and Percy and Monsignor believe that we fail even to do that in these times in which we live. We live lives that are uprooted from Christ. Lots of people use words like, for example, rights and dignity and freedom, all of which come from the church, but they are uprooted from the person of Christ, the soil in which they grow. And so we see those virtues withering, not because they are not true or good, but because we expect them to keep growing without being planted and nurtured. I thought that was interesting, his analogy between the devaluation of words and the devaluation of money. The bill looks the same, he writes on page 29, but it's not worth as much. He says the same thing happens with uprooted words like rights, dignity, and freedom. Those are my examples. They no longer mediate reality as they once did, he said. So they look the same, sound the same, but they don't have the same worth. But as he says, things like suffering and sin do not go away. So what do we do now? Because we certainly see these attempts to destroy the causes of suffering and sin, but also the very words themselves. We're not even allowed to use the word sin anymore, even though it still exists. It still causes suffering. I really appreciate why Monsignor leaves us here with the words of Father Smith. So let's just sort of wrap up here. Because that same priest, Father Smith, imperfect yet saintly, established a healthcare facility and then begged a group of physicians to send to him any people considered burdensome, young or old, suffering, dying, afflicted, useless, born or unborn. Please, he said, don't kill them. Send them to us. We'll take care of them. God will bless you for it, and you will offend no one except the great prince Satan who rules the world. Now those words are of the fictional priest, Father Smith, from that Walker Percy story. But in recalling them here for us, you can just hear in them Albacete's own affection for the work of that very real priest, St. Padre Pio, who did very real battle with the evil one, and whose hospital for the relief of suffering touched Albacete deeply and stayed with him well after returning home here to the States. So people like this gave birth in Monsignor to a hope that overcame the temptation to despair under the weight of his own experiences of suffering. And I think he found hope in these authors and their characters, like we talk about Walker Percy and Flannery O'Connor, as well as saints like St. Padre Pio, real people, because, as we'll read in the next chapter, they helped him, Albacete, to stay rooted in reality, which is that life is a drama into which we've all been written by God, and that we've all got a part to play, a contribution to make to the story, and that your sufferings have something to offer me and mine you, and that life, as painful as it is always worth living. But we'll talk more about that next time. We'll continue with Chapter 3 in the next reflection, Suffering and Pain, proceeding from pages 32 through 37 of Albacete's Cry of the Heart.